This is a webcast for United States History, Unit 1, American Imperialism, SI number 9, The Great War. All right, as you can see on the screen there, this is the PowerPoint for the Great War. We also know that as World War I in a nutshell. This is going to be a quick overview of the Great War. What I mean by quick, we don't study the European war with as much detail and time as you might have in sophomore history. So in this one SI, we're going to try to review some major concepts that you should have studied already. You might remember reading All Quiet on the Western Front, the book read last year in sophomore history. It's a great book, giving a very important perspective about the war and the effects of war, particularly the effects of war on the young combatants that are called upon to fight and die. So we have a set of topics here that we're going to work through. Up at the top of this screen is a link. I suggest that you plug that link in on your computer. It's a nice little video that just kind of reviews some of the basic history of how the Great War got started. Well, I'll explain some of that also here. This world map is just showing you the nations, the powerful nations of the world, and how they went out and conquered and controlled other territories globally. So we know when we study the Great War, World War I, that there are four broad causes, long-term causes. One is imperialism, which is what this map is showing, that had taken place throughout the 1800s. Another cause of the Great War is nationalism. Nationalism is a pride in one's nation. It's also defined as a desire to be free from foreign rule. So you might remember in this story, there's a territory called Bosnia. Sarajevo is a major city in Bosnia that had been annexed and taken and incorporated in a broader empire called the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Well, the Bosnians didn't want to be part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And so throughout its history as a territory of Austria-Hungary, there was some agitation, and groups and individuals would carry out certain tactics, terrorism tactics, to try to liberate themselves so that Bosnia could be a free and independent country. And within Bosnia, it's kind of a multi-ethnic territory. There are some Serbs that lived in here. You can see Serbia as a neighboring territory that was a free and independent country. And so the Serbs of Bosnia were some of the most radicalized citizens that participated and carried out acts of aggression and terrorism towards the Austro-Hungarian political establishment. So we have imperialism, we have nationalism as a cause of the Great War, World War I, and we also have militarism. Militarism, there's a tremendous amount of militaristic buildup by the European nations. As their armies and their navies got larger, and certainly as they competed against one another throughout the age of imperialism, it just created rivalries and tension. And you can see in this political cartoon the militarism, arms race, also nationalism, the prides of these European nations, on top of some of the other logs on the fire, are going to create an inferno. And ultimately, that inferno is going to be World War One. The other metaphor used in the World War One story is a powder keg. Europe was a powder keg. It was a, a keg of gunpowder that was pressurizing, and all it needed was a spark to detonate. So the short-term cause of the Great War is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. You see Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie uh, traveling in this open car, part of a motorcade. Here they're being shot by an assassin, and well, here's your assassin. Gavrilo Princip is one of those Bosnian radicalized Serbs, part of a terror organization called the Black Hand, who knew that Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the second in command, or the heir to the throne, was going to be traveling in Sarajevo. And so they organized a plot to assassinate him. And sure enough, not according to the plot details, but sure enough, Gavrilo Princip will take the opportunity and shoot and kill the heir to the throne of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. That's the spark that detonates the power keg and puts everything into motion, creating the Continental War of the Great War. So here are your Allied partners. We have the Allies versus the Central Powers, blue Central Powers. The original Central Powers were made up of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And of course, Central Powers because they're in the center of Europe. And then the Allied powers are all in red here. Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, was brought in as part of the Central Powers once the war got started. You can see that Germany and Austria-Hungary have a geographic disadvantage, that they're pinned in between Western and Eastern enemy allied forces. So that definitely puts them at a bit of a disadvantage. Well, the assassination created a chain reaction. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia, the Balkan nation to its south there, for the assassination because Serbian nationalists, even though they were living in Bosnia, which is right here, they were Serbian, and so Serbia, the nation, was blamed for the assassination. An ultimatum was given to Serbia, which was ultimately not fulfilled, and so a declaration of war of Austria-Hungary was declared upon Serbia. But Serbia had a promise of protection from Russia, and so once Serbia was threatened, Russia began to mobilize its forces and declared war on Austria-Hungary, who has its protector in Germany, and so Germany mobilized its forces and declared war against Russia. At this point, there's a big question about what France is going to do. Will France join this war in protection of its allied partner, Russia? And Germany kind of takes the first punch, takes the action, tries to create the element of surprise, and mobilizes forces to the west by going through this Belgium nation here, which is white, which shows neutrality, and begins to attack the western border of France. You can see here that we have the developments of a two-front war campaign being developed here. But it was the German intent to try to attack first France, defeat it within about a 6 weeks period of time, get a formalized surrender from France so that they can take their troops and then mobilize and bring it east against Russia, who it thought would not be able to organize and mobilize its forces um, within this 6-week military campaign that Germany has strategized. Well, it also created a hornet's nest, this westward movement by the Germans, because it violated the neutrality of Belgium, which angered Great Britain, and so Great Britain will mobilize its troops, send it across the English Channel, not to attack France, but to support France against the German invasion. And this brings about the Great War. There's a painting. You can kind of see some military conflict. You got hand-to-hand combat, combatants choking, stabbing the rifle and a bayonet. You can see the German helmet there, the Allied helmet, differentiating the different sides fighting in this scene, giving some allusions to some trench warfare. Remember, the battlefronts that were developed in this war were certainly the Western Front, which is what All Quiet on the Western Front is based upon. We also saw a battlefront in Italy, um, the really long line there of the Eastern Front, and also warfare in the Balkans. So this is a continental war. It's a world war in the sense that it has a lot of worldwide participants, but predominantly the war was fought in the continent of Europe, and of course there's some ocean battles that do take place as well. Here's another look of the Western Front. You can kind of see the length of the front from Switzerland all the way to the English Channel was the length of the Western Front. And of course it meandered over time. You can see the lines of the battlefront change according to the effects of various battles fought throughout the four years. The Germans initially pushed all the way close to Paris, but in the Battle of the Marne, the British and the French troops will stop the German movement, and then of course there's going to be some retreat and some digging in, which will establish the lines of the Western Front pretty much throughout the 4-year campaign. So another diagram just showing you different trench systems, a frontline trench connected to a support trench, which has some machine gun, bunker, encampments all tied into a reserve trench where some other troops were placed in case they needed to rush to the front lines. You see some artillery pieces in the rear. Of course, these trench systems did go subterranean. Had some places for people to experience the war underground. Barbed wire. You might remember the pock marks showing you the the moonscape landscape because of the artillery bombings that destroyed the physical landscape. And here you have some army soldiers that are already rushing across no man's land in this direction, attacking this frontline trench. So we don't see their trench systems. This graph only gives us kind of half the picture. It's also alluding to aircraft comes into play, is militarized and used during the Great War. So black and white photo here of some Allied troops working through the network of their trenches, about ready to go over the top, which is out of their trench, out onto the battlefield, into what is called no man's land. No man's land, if I go back to the original diagram, is the territory that exists between both frontline trench systems of the competing armies of the Allies and the Central Powers. So you can see these Allied forces, they've already gotten out of their trenches, they've made their way through the frontline barbed wire systems, and you can kind of see that they're going to be continuing on into the horizon across no man's land on a military operation. The emphasis of the word stalemate, the war is a bloody disaster. in which no side really had a great advantage over the other, and so there was a deadlock, a stalemate. And so throughout the war, there were attempts to try to break that stalemate using different tactics and different military innovations to bring about a victory. Another image of Allied soldiers in their trench. You can see it's been dug out. There's also been some buildup using some sandbags to try to get some elevation so that the men can sit down, having themselves protected, not exposed from sniper fire. Um, Also, you can see that the ground here is muddied, certainly throughout different times of the year. They're going to get rainfall and snow, and so this basin would collect water, and they'd be living in dirt and mud throughout their tour of duty on the Western Front. Another image of Allied soldiers sloshing through their trench, much deeper of mud now, about knee high, um, likely due to a storm and its effects. I want to point out on the front of these soldiers there's a bag which is housing their gas mask. So we know in the Great War both sides used chemical agents to uh, weaken and kill and disable soldiers to try to get an advantage. Here we have some Allied soldiers being carried, their feet heavily bandaged. That is because they are suffering from trench foot. When you exist in these type of muddy and wet conditions, your feet become numbed, the skin um, gets soft and cracked and infected, and if you don't treat your feet properly, um, basically infection sets in that begins to wear and eat away of the flesh and muscle of your feet. It becomes very painful. It can be treated if treated on time and properly, but oftentimes, if it's not treated well, feet and lower limbs would have to be amputated. This is a picture of trench foot. As you can see, the feet have rotted muscle and skin, and literally bone structure has been eaten away by infection. So this is a severe case of trench foot. Rats were always a nuisance in the trenches. Uh, as the physical landscape was being destroyed by artillery shells, the rats often sought refuge in the trenches where they might find food because of the men's rations and even some warmth. Oftentimes men would wake up with rats nestled uh, next to their bodies. And you can see these German soldiers have had some fun catching and presenting their rat game there. Um, the the stalemate was caused by weapons of World War One, and there are also going to be some weapons that are going to be innovated to break the stalemate. So we'll focus on some of the fighting weapons and tactics here. The machine gun largely caused the stalemate. You can see this rifle would be a traditional rifle. It has to be uh, loaded and aimed, as opposed to a automatic um, belt-fed weapon would have a tremendous amount of firepower that would be able to expel and keep enemy soldiers from getting into your trench. So all sides and nations developed their own machine guns, and it was a devastating weapon that really kept the battle lines in place placed for most of the war and preserving the stalemate of the Great War. These large guns, these artillery pieces were used, which creates some of the most uh, of the physical damage and caused more of the casualties than any weapon, as well as some of the psychological damage. These weapons would fire huge rounds, as you can see in this picture here. These shells would be loaded here in this chamber. Um, and oftentimes these artillery barrages would go on for hours and hours to weaken a particular element along the trench lines. And then following that bombardment would come troops rushing across no man's land to kind of finish the job, if possible. But the constant bombardment led to what was called shell shock. Today we call this post-traumatic stress disorder. You can see in these images, there's three gentlemen who have suffered the effects of the trauma, the psychological trauma from the Great War. And so their minds are shot, their bodies are not working properly because of all of the trauma that they experienced along the front. I want to show you a little clip of shell shock. You can see here some hospital footage from a soldier who is psychologically and physically affected from the war trauma he experienced on the Western Front. He can't control or manage his body naturally any longer. But of course, he's at this hospital for treatment. And here you see the same individual now walking normally. So we have signs of success there, how doctors are able to treat a soldier and allow them to be able to return to some standard of life. All right. We have some images here that show the use of chemical agents in World War I. See a line of troops here ready to rush in this direction after these canisters of gas have been released. And so the gas is heavier than air, and it's kind of blowing along the ground towards the enemy trench lines. These gas could also be distributed through artillery shells. So once a gas attack was identified, a bell or a whistle was sounded and soldiers would put their gas mask on. You can see here some soldiers that have been affected by gas. There was different forms of gas. Some were lethal. Some could give you a severe wound which could kill you, such as mustard gas. If the mustard gas got into your mouth or your eyes, create some serious blistering, which could cause you some problems and cause you to die if you sustained enough gas within your system. We have tanks came online in World War I to try to break the stalemate across no man's land. We've used now planes in World War I, first to be able to get a bird's eye view, an aerial view to gather intelligence. Then eventually they started dropping bombs from them, and then eventually they put machine guns on them to knock bomber planes out of the sky. Zeppelins, which is a German manufacturing of a dirigible or a blimp, was used to, in this case, to terrorize citizens of London. So two different forms of aerial combat there. And then, of course, we have ocean warfare with battleships and submarines. So the Germans used U-boats to prowl around western ports, try to disable Great Britain and also the United States once we joined the war, from being able to supply Allied forces on the Western Front. So in the air, in the sea and on land, different innovations used in this conflict. And we'll finish with this chart. This chart shows you the graphic here of casualties. So a lot of numbers there, and certainly not expecting you to memorize them, but if we can look at the grand total of both the Allied forces and the Central forces that were mobilized for war, we have over 65 million men were put into military service. Grand total. The grand total of KIA, killed in action, is 8.5 million. Now we'll break that down. 3.3 million were from the Central Powers, and 5.1 million Allied soldiers died in World War One. So notice, the Allies win the war, but they lost more men. Here on the wounded side, 12,831,000 were wounded from the Allies, and just over 8 million were wounded for the Central Powers. Again, more wounded on the Allied side, and they won. So what am I trying to emphasize here? This is a war of attrition. More nations equals more men capability, makes men more expendable. You can suffer more casualties and still bring about a victory in the war. Remember, the United States only participated in the last year of the war. We did not join right away. And our total mobilization is just over 4 million. The total number of KIA American soldiers, 126,000. 234,300 are wounded in our World War I campaign. So the casualties per mobilization, our number is significantly smaller. Of all of our mobilized, 8% were a casualty. So it doesn't even come close to countries like France and Russia, Germany. Look at Austria, Hungary. 90% of their mobilized soldiers were a casualty of some form.